Well, let me say a little bit about how I got to where I am. So, as you know, I teach in Princeton, and you may know, especially if you were wandering around out there and saw the book display, that back in 2006, I wrote a book on same-gender relationships in which I advocated for the acceptance of same-gender relationships in the church, the legal legitimation of same-gender relationships in marriage, and the acceptance of gay folks within the civil polity, and had an argument about what it means to be a democracy, what it means to be welcoming, and so on and so forth. That was in 2006, and my argument there was presented, I tried to present it in a way that was ironic and open to even folks who disagreed with me. In fact, I had the manuscript read by people who disagreed with me to see if I was being fair to their positions. In 2012, I rewrote the book because things had changed so rapidly. And by 2012, in 2006, it wasn't clear that the society was going to agree with what I was arguing for. By 2011, it was clear that things had shifted, that the society at large was moving to the position that I and others were advocating. Not that I'm some hero, that's not the point. In 2012, my tone was basically, you know what, this is where we are, this is where we should be, we got to get with the program. But here's what I noticed, and this is the transition to where I am today. What I began to notice was, back in the old days, the people who were advocating for this, both GLBTQ, etc., people and their allies, the burden of proof was on us. We had to make a case. And we were in the minority at the time, and we were making a minority position, but over time, that has shifted very dramatically. What has happened since then, all of a sudden, things have shifted so much that the burden of proof on that issue in our culture has shifted in the other direction. It has shifted in the other direction, especially the farther you go down in age. The younger a person is, the more likely they are to say, well, yeah, gay marriage, of course. And they're likely to say, and what was your problem, church, that you couldn't see it? And what is this deal? So I'm going to be 60 this summer, and the fact is that my entire adult life, my entire ministry in the church, I've been ordained, 30-something years, and maybe I've been an adult in the church for 40 years. For that entire 40 years, that's the only thing mainline religion has been fighting about, is these culture war issues, right? And we still see it even in our politics today. Louise and I are both North Carolinians, and you may know that North Carolina has just passed this just kind of silly law about bathrooms. I mean, talk about an issue where there was no issue and no problem. There was no problem needing to be solved, and yet we have a law, right? So what's happened is that things have so shifted that especially if you're hanging out with young people, and that's basically what I do these days, hang out with people who are young, things have shifted so much that the burden of proof has shifted not only on this culture war issue, but the burden of proof has so shifted that people wonder, young people wonder, what is Christianity all about? In fact, once my daughter in college called me up on the telephone. I'm the big theology professor. She called me up, and she grew up in the church and all that, and she called me up. I think she was a freshman in college. She had been meeting new people, and she called me up and she said, "Dad, do Christians hate gay people?" Well, so we talked about that. What I'm now seeing is that The real issue has shifted from these so-called culture war issues to what is Christianity anyway? What is it? And specifically, which version of Christianity do we want to inhabit? Which version of Christianity do we want to embrace? And the fact is, there's more than one version. And I don't have time to go into this today, but if we were to go back into history, and you know from my sermon, I kind of like history. It's not because I'm one of these history buffs, it's because I think, I'm just being honest with you, I think we have so distorted Jesus, and we've so distorted Jesus' message that we're in trouble. We've so depoliticized Jesus, whose message, I couldn't say this in a sermon because I don't want to just get too incendiary myself. We've depoliticized Jesus. We've domesticated Jesus. We've sentimentalized Jesus. In fact, even as I was writing the sermon and I got to the end of it, I kept trying to find something at the end that was inspirational, the kind of thing you can put on a refrigerator magnet, because that's kind of what we've done with this thing. Okay? So my struggle as a professor who is now looking at the end game of life, I don't know how many more years I'll be teaching, don't know how many more years I'll be on this earth. I'm trying to figure out what is Christianity? Or what parts of Christianity are worth continuing with, and which parts of Christianity are, from a bygone age and should be dispensed with. Now, to even raise that question is very nerve-wracking for some folks. Some people will say, you can't ask that question. Especially in seminary. A lot of people don't want to ask these questions. Okay? But I think we have to ask these questions. In fact, I would go so far as to say the future of mainline religion, insofar as it depends on us, and I'm happy to say that ultimately everything depends on God, but to say that doesn't help very much. Okay, it depends on God. Whether I get struck by a car this afternoon, it depends on God. It all depends on God. But what am I going to do practically? And how am I going to think through things in the real world? Okay? So in mainline religion today, and my conviction is that as I watch young people leave the church in large numbers, I mean, it's a phenomenon. It's not a phenomenon I'm worried about. I'm not one of these people who thinks, oh no, the institution's going to collapse. I don't really care about that. I care about it at a certain level because you have to have institutions, you have to have structures. I get that. I'm a lawyer, for heaven's sake. Lawyers are all about institutions and structures and how we do things. I'm not worried that people are leaving. I'm concerned that they may be doing so without adequately thinking through what they're doing. Because I believe that Christianity does still matter, and it matters whether our version of the church continues or not. Does that make sense so far? Do you kind of get where I'm coming from? I'm struggling with the what the hell are we doing here question. Why are we here on a Sunday morning, Sunday afternoon, continuing to do this church thing? My conviction is that it's profoundly important. It's profoundly important because of what I called this morning the incendiary Jesus, who preached things like love your neighbor as yourself, which comes right out of the law in the Old Testament. Love your neighbor as yourself. But Jesus goes even further. Not just love your neighbor as yourself, love your enemy. He takes law, he takes ethics, he takes doing the right thing, he takes what the prophets cared about, justice, righteousness, and intensifies them. With Jesus, it's always, yeah, you have heard it said, but I say to you. It's always, yeah, we have these ethical principles, but guess what? It's even more demanding than you ever conceived. I'm going to do a little digression here, which if you get to know me, you'll realize I'm always digressing. In fact, I've got all these notes here. I haven't even started with the notes yet. I'm just talking to you. One of my favorite philosophers is a man named Emmanuel Levinas. I don't know if anyone here has read Emmanuel Levinas.
How do you spell it?
Levinas. Emmanuel Levinas. I don't have time. I'm not going to talk about Levinas at length today. Levinas was from Lithuania, Jew, went to France, studied in France, adopted the French language, became a soldier in World War II, had on the French uniform, was captured, was a POW. Because of the way the Nazis considered the French, they had occupied France, right? So they did not take Jewish soldiers from France and kill them. They put them in separate camps, but they did not exterminate them. The French uniform protected them. So Levinas survived World War II, though he was Jewish, but his wife and daughter were at risk. They were at risk of being deported and killed. A Catholic friend of his saved them. He was what we call in Holocaust studies a rescuer. Okay? But Levinas's entire family of origin was exterminated in the death camps. Either that or they starved or were killed or whatever. He lost everyone except his wife and daughter. You talk about trauma. This is huge trauma. And so then his philosophy is, how do you deal with this trauma? And his question, he's one of, in philosophy, some people are foxes and some people are hedgehogs. Foxes know everything. They read everything, they know everything. And some of this is temperamental. My wife will tell you, I'm kind of a fox. Actually, I think she's kind of a fox. Foxes know everything. The hedgehog knows one thing, and comes back to it over and over and over and over and over again. And Levinas's one thing was, how could our civilization have done this? How could we have all of these moral people? I mean, think about it. Germany was the most enlightened, quote unquote, country on earth, you could argue. I mean, great universities and all this, have all these ethicists and so on and so forth. How could this happen? And Levinas asked the question, could it be the case we've been fooled by morality? Has our morality misled us? And his entire philosophy has to do with getting rid of all the encumbrances and asking, what is our obligation to the other? What is our obligation to the person in need? What is our obligation to the person right here in front of us at this very moment who encounters us in what he calls the face-to-face encounter? And I could honestly talk for weeks about Levinas. I'm not going to do that. Just trust me, he's a profound thinker about our obligation, our ethical demand. And what he believes is that our ethical obligation is endless. It's a hell of a philosophy. It's very burdensome, but it's also, when I teach it, many students come away thinking, but there's something true about this, right? Our obligation is endless. Give you an illustration of what I mean by endless. Many of you probably have owed a debt. Maybe a house payment, maybe a car payment, maybe a student loan. Heck, some of you probably not only have your own debts, you have other people's debts you're responsible for. It could be. Somebody, you know what I'm talking about? You owe a debt, right? You know what I'm talking about. And you pay it off. And as you pay it the amount of the debt goes down. The more you pay, make these payments, you pay over many years, the amount of the debt goes down. Goes down, 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 down. Eventually, if you're lucky, you pay it off. What Levinas wants to tell us, and I'm telling you this because I think this is what Jesus is telling us too, about morality, about ethics. It is the sort of debt, it's the sort of obligation that the more you pay, the more you owe. The deeper you go in the moral life, the Christian life, the Jewish life, heck, the Buddhist life, whatever, the moral religious life, the deeper you go, the more you feel you need to give. You have heard it said, but I say to you, right? You've heard it said, do this, don't do that. I say to you, it's even more demanding than you ever imagined. So the strange thing is we have all these young folks who want to change the world and who want to give their lives. They want to give their... I talk to people all the time, young people in their 20s. They all want to change the world. All they want to talk about is discovering their passion, and they want to give themselves away. And yet they look at the church and they go, but that's not where you do that. You don't do that in church. So we have a huge problem. And my claim is we need to rediscover sort of the basics about Jesus, Christianity, ethics, and so on and so forth. That's my simple message. A few more things, since we're here. As I think about mainline religion, and I'm bullish on mainline religion, believe it or not, I actually think that we have tremendous resources in mainline churches, Presbyterian, UCC, all of them. But that's one thing I like about the Cleveland story is, Cleveland's had some struggles, but it's coming back. And that's my hope for mainline religion. There are two dominant narratives about how to explain what's going on in mainline religion today. The first narrative, this is probably the most popular, is a narrative of decline. A narrative of decline. Basically says, look, mainline churches continue to lose members. People are going out the door. More and more people say they don't, when they check off what religion are you, they check off none of the above. We now have a word for that in sociology, the nuns, not nuns like wearing a habit, N-U-N, but N-O-N-E-S. None of the above. I'm not affiliated with any of these religions. I'm what? I'm spiritual but not religious. Okay? So the first is a narrative of decline, and the typical remedy, according to the narrative of decline, is we need to get defensive, we need to circle the wagons, we need to get back to the old-time religion. We need to get rid of liberals like Johnson, and especially him. In fact, most of them track the decline of mainline religion to the year 1956 when Johnson was born. It's all my fault. The second narrative, now let me just say, there is an element of truth in the first narrative. There is a lot of decline. The second narrative, it's not a narrative of decline, it's a narrative of transition. Narrative of transition. And I don't have time to, just trust me, these two narratives exist, and there's deep sociological study that backs up both of these. The second is a narrative of transition. And essentially what that narrative says is, it's not that mainline religion is declining. It's that mainline religion is transitioning. In fact, mainline religion, churches like this, they're victims of their own success. They've been so successful. You've been so successful in teaching children, your children, moral values. Before Christianity, you would take, infants that you didn't want, you'd expose them on rocks. Before Christianity, you would go out and have gladiator fights, and people would crush each other's skulls for sport, right? Christianity has done amazing things to humanize the world, and a lot of people embrace these Christian values, even though they wouldn't consider going to church. A lot of people wouldn't consider going to church, but they're actually kind of glad that churches exist. If you ask who their heroes are, they might say, well, Mother Teresa. You can't get any more religious than Mother Teresa, come on. They might say, well, we like this new pope. Right? Martin Luther King Jr. Guy was a Baptist minister. They're happy for there to be religious people, and they're not so much hostile to the church, but they don't know what to make of church today. So there's a transitioning that's happening in which the shape of religious life is changing. This is the reason when Mark and I were speaking last night, we were talking about a church in a particular city I was telling him about that's feeding tens of thousands of meals. I think they've served something like 60-some thousand meals to homeless people. They're engaged in tremendous ministry. And one of the questions they've been asking is, how do we make sure that this ministry remains Christian? And the question is, well, what do you mean by Christian? I mean, you're feeding the poor. Is that not Christian? Right? So in the transition narrative, we may be doing church in lots of different places in ways that we don't associate with steeples and so on and so forth, narrative of transition. A little narrative I don't want to talk about, except I'll just mention it. There's also a narrative of emergence, and I don't think that amounts to anything. I know I'm on camera. I don't like that because I have a lot of friends who are talking about emergence and the emergent church. The emergent church seems to me, and I don't know if you've heard of this, but the emergent church seems to me to be folks who are evangelical, who are disillusioned with evangelicalism, who are trying to do something new, but mostly what they're doing new, believe it or not, is embracing the theology that mainline religion embraced a generation or two ago. So I'm not sure that that's really separate from these other two narratives. However, even though you've got these two narratives and there's an element of truth in each of them, I'm not convinced of either one. I'm not convinced of the narrative of decline. I like the narrative of transition, and if I had to pick one, I would pick transition. But I worry, I'll be honest with you, I worry that if we just go too far in the direction of transition, we may lose sort of the heartbeat of the thing. We need to maintain Christian identity. I don't say that as a conservative. I'm not a conservative. I say it as a practical person who knows that people need identity. Identity is important. So I'm going to construct my own narrative, and I'm going to call it a narrative of prophetic engagement. Prophetic engagement, which tries to make common ground with the traditionalists, narrative of decline, tradition, we're losing our tradition. I want to say, look, you're right. Traditions are important, especially the core of the tradition, which I take to be what I call prophetic religion, what the Hebrew prophets believed: justice, righteousness, concern for the poor, all the things Jesus preached about, the kingdom of God. You think about what Jesus did. Jesus had table fellowship with outcasts. That's at the center of his ministry, right? Those things are at the core. Let's not lose those. But in keeping with the narrative of transition, we engage the world wherever the world happens to be, without imposing a bunch of rules or a bunch of do's and don'ts. We make common cause with folks who are of other religions or of no religion. And one of the things that's included in this narrative for me, and I'm going to step around this podium, and I hope you can still hear me. Can you still hear me? Okay, because I have this big old voice. You can still hear me. I actually believe that inherent in Christianity, see, a lot of people will tell you what I'm about to say is, they think what I'm about to say is crazy, but it's really not. Even Louise would agree that I'm not crazy on this point. I think she would. We'll see. She'll certainly correct me if I'm wrong. I think that Christianity is inherently secular, and I think that Christianity is inherently pluralistic. Now you may say, he is crazy, because most people would say secular pluralism is the enemy of faith. It's the enemy of the church. We have secular people who say we shouldn't, the churches are terrible. Well, let me tell you what I'm trying to get at here. What does the word secular mean? And where does the word secular come from? Well, one of the great architects of the very word secular, guess who it was? Our good friend, Mr. Augustine. And I don't know how much you know about theology, but you can't get any more traditional than Augustine. And I love Augustine. I don't agree with Augustine on everything, just to be honest. But Augustine talks about the saeculum and how Christians make common cause in the area of the secular. So what does secular mean? The word secular is simply a word for that which we hold in common, that which all of us hold in common. So we're Presbyterians, we're Christians, we're in the city of Cleveland, but we hold things in common with people who aren't Presbyterians, with people who have other religious beliefs, or people who have no religious belief. Right? I could give you a sports analogy. Some of you know, a few of you know that I'm a big basketball fan, and I'm kind of a weird basketball fan because I'm one of these people that I so love the game that I have many teams that I root for, even teams that hate each other. I'll follow this team this year. Yeah, that team, I really like that team this year. I'm really into the sport, the game, right? But there's some people who are sort of partisans of this team versus that team, and that's okay, right? That's fine. That's cool. Both of my friends here, my wife, my friend, they went to Duke, right?
Go Blue Devils.
And everybody at Duke hates UNC, North Carolina. But the fact is, and there have been some periods in history where what I'm about to say never would have happened. But these days, on the off season, actually players for Duke and Carolina, they play pickup ball with each other because they love the game. Yeah, they're rivals. There are times when they hate each other on the court, but the game is bigger. And that's the point here. There's a bigger game. There's a bigger thing happening in the world. It's bigger, it's broader than our particular perspective. We can't give up our perspective. I don't want us to give up our take on the world as Christians. But the kingdom of God, and Augustine's very clear on this, the kingdom of God isn't identical with the church. Never has been. The kingdom of God is much bigger than the church. The church bears witness to something that's bigger than itself. So I could argue this all afternoon. Just trust me, or at least run with me for a few minutes. I think Christianity is inherently secular. It inherently reaches out to that which we hold in common with our fellow human beings. I think the ministry of Jesus is full of Jesus encountering people who are different. Right? Remember the Syrophoenician woman? You know, he's not supposed to even be talking to her, and she's not supposed to be talking to him. And, you know, let me just tell you, there's nobody more Jewish than Jesus. If you read the New Testament very carefully, the cities in Palestine that are the most Roman and the most Gentile, the most non-Jewish, Jesus doesn't go into those cities. He always stays on the outside. He's very, very Jewish. Syrophoenician woman, he says, you know, she wants to be blessed or whatever, and he says, why should I even be talking to you? You're a dog. And she says, that even the dogs get crumbs. And Jesus actually learned something from her. That's one way to read that passage. I think Christianity is inherently secular. And all the know-nothings out there who are telling you that we should be secular and not Christian, or we should, I hate to name names, but Richard Dawkins is a good example of someone who says, oh, we're all atheists. And when I listen to him, I say, the way you define who God is, I'm an atheist too. I don't want to have anything to do with that God. But the God who loves the world, the whole world, I think Christianity is inherently secular. I also think, this is going to be a harder sell, but I still think it's true. I think Christianity is inherently pluralistic. And you can say, how can it possibly be inherently pluralistic? Well, think about it. Christianity is a strange cocktail. Or if you don't like the word cocktail, I don't know, I don't want to offend anyone. It's a strange mixture of the Hebrew and the Greco-Roman. I told you that Alexander the Great came in and conquered Palestine 300 years before Jesus. Guess what? All those Jews, they may have spoken Aramaic, but most of them spoke Greek. They translated their Bible into Greek. It had become a Hellenistic culture. Jesus inhabits a Hellenistic culture, even though Palestine is still very Jewish, right? So they already were mixing religions together. In fact, Christianity, I would argue, is, people say, oh, Christianity today needs to be interreligious. I would say, you're darn right it does. We need to make common cause with Buddhists and Hinduists and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But Christianity has always been inherently interreligious from the beginning. Even something like incarnation. Most of you were probably raised to believe in the incarnation, that, God became human in Jesus Christ. This is actually, from where I sit, more of a Greco-Roman idea than it is a Hebrew idea. So even something as profound and deep as incarnation is already a kind of interreligious idea. I'm saying all this to us to give us some permission as we think through what is Christianity to breathe a little easier. There are a lot of folks who have been telling me my whole life, this is what Christianity is, this is what it isn't. Actually, I think we're in a day and age when it's not so clear what the boundaries are, and we have some play in which to think it through. Louise, my wife, always likes to remind me of a distinction some sociologists made up between a so-called bounded set and a centered set. Have you heard of this? Bounded set, centered set. This is how you define identity, or how you define whatever it is, a group, a community, how you define basketball fans or hockey fans or whatever. One way to define it is a bounded set. You create a boundary, and only the people who are inside the boundary, however you define that boundary, it's like, oh, we love the monsters. And if you love the monsters, you're inside. If you don't like the monsters, man, you're outside. Forget it. Forget about it, as they say up in New Jersey and New York, right? So you've got people who are insiders and people who are outsiders. These culture war debates that we've had for years and years and years, we have often defined insiders, outsiders. Oh, he's one of us, she's not, etc. That's a bounded set. The other way to think of it as a centered set, in which you center, everyone's centered on a certain thing, and the boundary remains loose and porous and open. You've probably experienced this in your community life, where oh, you know what? We all agree that X needs to happen, and I actually don't like this person over there, but I'm going to make common cause with them because we're focused on this same goal right here. So the question isn't, to me, it's not who's in and who's out. It's getting straight, what is the core? What is the core? And then when we define the core, how do we get people together around that core? And my contention, if you listen to the sermon today, I actually think that if Jesus is the core, what Jesus is about prophetic religion. He's about the reign of God. He's about, we're supposed to be ethical, but guess what? We're supposed to actually be even more ethical than we ever imagined. And I have to whisper something to you, since you're Presbyterians. This means that the Reformation, and I've got a book out there on John Calvin, and I love John Calvin, and I love Martin Luther. I love the Reformation. And there's a huge element of truth in the Reformation. A huge element of truth. We live by grace. But we often forget, Luther said this, Calvin said it even more clearly, we live by grace, justification, saved by grace, but we also live by sanctification, becoming holy, becoming more righteous, living into righteousness. And I personally think that in mainline religion, we've gone so far in the direction of justification. Oh yeah, we trust in grace, and that's the end of it. We've forgotten the other side, which is sanctification. It's Levinas. The more I give, the more I participate, the more I owe. I'm never off the hook. I have to live by grace because otherwise I'd go crazy. But the more I live by grace, the more grace abounds, the more I have to give. The more burden. You see the paradox? And the problem is, what we do is, we do this often with the prayer of confession. You confess your sins and then someone says, you're forgiven, and that's the end of it. That was never the end of it for Calvin. Calvin, the way Calvin set it up, I don't know if you know this, Calvin, you would confess your sins, you would be forgiven, and then you would recite the Ten Commandments. Because, having confessed, having been forgiven, you're now supposed to go and live justice and righteousness. Prophetic religion, right? Religion makes a difference. Our young people want to change the world. Calvin did change the world. Jesus did change the world. Okay, now I'm going to just hit you with one more quick thing. I haven't even gotten to my notes yet. This is the last thing, and I'm going to just open it up. I could talk all day, but you don't want that. Trust me, you don't want that.
There's always tomorrow.
There is always tomorrow. Louise will have to listen to it on the plane on the way back, right?
Or not.
Or not. She's got some earphones. This will be my last comment. So, let's go back to Augustine. Augustine is great. I love Augustine. But Augustine is also a huge problem. I said it. There it is. He's a huge problem. Guy was a genius. I could spend the rest of my life just reading Augustine. He's so wonderful. But he's also a huge problem. One reason that he's great is he wrote something, I don't know if you've ever looked at or heard of his book, The Confessions. It has beautiful language in it. It opens up and it says something like this. Thou hast, it's talking about, in fact, the whole book of the Confessions is nothing but a prayer to God. In the whole book, he doesn't so much declare, he doesn't say, this is what God is like to you all, to the reader, the whole book is a prayer to God. It's beautiful. It's a beautiful thing. And he'll say things like, "Thou hast made us for thyself, and our hearts are restless till they find their rest in thee." Beautiful. You've made us for yourself. Our hearts are restless until they find their rest in God. It's beautiful. And for Augustine, the way you find that rest is through the inner life, the spiritual life. And in fact, it's hard to find. You can find little glimpses of this in Scripture. For example, Jeremiah. You get a portrait in Jeremiah, especially his laments, and maybe the psalmist. In the Psalms and laments, you get a portrait of an inner life in turmoil being poured out to God. But it's really Augustine who begins to think about the inner life, the spiritual life, philosophically, to really think it through in all of its parameters. There's probably not anyone in the Western tradition who's more of a fountainhead of the spiritual life than Augustine. There's some other examples, but he's the biggie. I love that about Augustine. It's beautiful stuff. People who say they're spiritual but not religious, trust me, Augustine is spiritual. But Augustine is also very religious. And Augustine was a bishop. And occasionally bishops have to do things that are tough. I get that. I respect that. This is what living in the world means. But there's a side of Augustine, I'm going to call it the compel them to come inside. Augustine was in a controversy. I won't go into the details right now in the interest of time. You got controversies in the church. How are you going to resolve them? Augustine got to a point where he said, compel them to come in, make them come in, coerce them to come in. That's the side of Augustine that's a little bit of a problem. And it's no surprise that it became a problem. You probably know this concept because I know Mark talks about this occasionally. I brought you 300 years before Jesus, Alexander the Great, 30 years before the temple episode when Jesus is a little boy. He knows about all this stuff. A lot of slaughter must have affected Jesus' consciousness. We had Jesus in the temple. Then 30 years later, we had the destruction of the temple. And by the way, I just have to whisper this. If you're a Jew living in Jesus' day, if your temple is corrupt, like during Jesus' life, if your temple's corrupt, you've got a huge problem because you need to have atonement, but you can't have atonement because the temple's corrupt. What are you going to do? I analogize it to the Cleveland Clinic. It's like having cancer and there are no doctors. There are just no doctors. There's no chemo. There's nothing. You're sunk. But think how bad it would be if the temple is destroyed. It's one thing for it to be corrupt. It's another thing for it to be destroyed. There is no clinic. You're on your own, folks. When Mark writes his gospel, that's the situation he's in. Not Paul's situation, he's back here. But much of the New Testament after, all the gospels are post-destruction of the temple. And you get all this language about atonement, how are we going to have atonement? And the reason is they can't have, the temple's gone. So they got to rethink everything. And it's rooted in a profound religious problem, which, by the way, we've then taken all that language, disconnected it from its context, and we have all this theology about atonement that we've made up. And that's really what we've done in the church. I'm sorry, but it's the truth. Most of our Easter hymns, I mean, they're beautiful. They're part of your piety. They're part of my piety. But they've been disconnected from this real life thing that happened, okay? But now I'm going to fast forward 300 more years, and I mentioned it in the sermon. Constantine becomes the emperor, or he is the emperor, and he becomes a Christian. And then the Roman Empire officially becomes Christian. And it's right after that that Augustine starts writing. It's right after that that Augustine is the bishop. And so what you get is, before, Christianity is this movement. Mark used the word movement. That's exactly the right word. It's this movement. It's very diverse. We don't have time to talk about the diversity is huge. I said Christianity is inherently pluralistic. Trust me, there was pluralism in the early church. It's diverse, it's a movement, but then it becomes official. And not only does it become official, it has connected to it what? The sword, the power of the state. So when you say compel them to come in, you're talking about if they don't come in, I mean, this is not necessarily Augustine, but his successors, if they don't come in, we're going to kill them. All of the major, well, I've got to be careful here. The major Christological doctrines in the church, the ones that have to do with Jesus, like Jesus is fully human, fully divine, all of that, all of these doctrines, I'm just being honest with you, were created after Constantine, and they all were imposed by the empire. This is a huge problem. It has created the situation where we tell, instead of just giving people Jesus, who's an incendiary figure, and I have some more colorful language I could use, but I'm on camera, that I sometimes use with my students. In fact, if I could title some of my courses, some of the language I would use, everybody in the school would take the courses. You can probably imagine what I'm talking about. We're going to come in and clean house and take names, or kick, and right? Jesus, right? Okay, so the problem is that we've gone from this incendiary figure in this movement that's prophetic, it's connected to the Hebrew prophets, and all of a sudden it becomes an empire, an institution, it's forced, you have to conform, etc. Which worked, actually. I'm not saying that was bad. It actually preserved Christianity for centuries, but we're now in a very different situation. We're in a situation where Christendom, let's call it Christendom, Christendom's disintegrating. This is partly why mainline religion looks like it's declining. Christendom is disintegrating, and so we have to rethink sort of the social form in which Christianity is going to exist. And thank God we have churches like this one that still have sort of a base of operations. You've got to have a base of operations if you're going to do anything in the world. But the way we do it is going to be profoundly different. And that's why I think we need help from someone else. Augustine, he's great. I love the guy. But he's also problematic. He is the architect of Christendom. And Christendom is a problem, which means Augustine is a problem, as wonderful as Augustine is. And I'm just, look, everything I just said is enough to if I were in a church like this where y'all don't live and breathe this stuff every day, it's like, oh, okay, Augustine. Where I live, this is like Duke versus Carolina. This is, if you say Augustine's a problem, there are some people who spent their whole career being Augustinians. Like in the Catholic Church, you've got a whole order called the Augustinians, right? That's why we need help from someone else. And in the American context, I'm just going to hit you with this and then I'm going to open it up. The person I've been looking to lately, you don't have to look to this person. The person I've been looking to is Ralph Waldo Emerson. Why am I looking at Emerson? Some weird guy from the 19th century? What the hell's that about? I think we have an Augustinian church, but we live in an Emersonian culture. And let me explain just briefly, and then I'll open this up. Emerson, for those of you who don't know much about Emerson, he grows up in Puritan New England, where all these people are Calvinists, they're Puritans, they've got rules, they've got ways of thinking. And it became so difficult, oppressive even for many people, that they created the Unitarians. We have Unitarian churches. It's like, we're Unitarians, we can't buy all this Augustinian stuff. We're going to be Unitarians. We're gonna still have ethics, we're going to have morality. Levinas wasn't living then, but they would love Levinas probably, whatever. But we're not so sure about some of these doctrinal issues. The doctrinal issues, and in fact, our children are this way. If they're honest with you, they'll say, you know what, I see that the church does some good things, but why does it make me believe the unbelievable? Why does it make me check my brain at the door and I have to embrace a bunch of doctrines that make no sense to me? This was already going on in the 19th century. They created the Unitarians, where you could have a little more freedom, right? Emerson is a Unitarian minister. He's one of the early Unitarian ministers. But what happens is, Emerson is such a free thinker that he can't even hang with the Unitarians. He thinks the Unitarians are too conservative. And Emerson leaves the Unitarians and he becomes a lecturer, just a free, he made his living, actually he inherited a little bit of money, which didn't hurt, never hurts. But he made his living just lecturing, just being a free thinker. It's like people today post on the web. There was no web then. Emerson did his thing in what's called the Lyceum Movement. I don't know if you've heard about this, but you had these, it was about 5% of the population back then that was educated. And these people would come and hear lectures. And Emerson was famous on the lecture circuit. He was lecturing to everyone. And what Emerson was about thinking for yourself. Emerson was about becoming what you need to become, which is still kind of Augustinian. We have a calling. These are not antithetical, but they're just different. Emerson, in fact, I would argue that Emerson is the first major intellectual, certainly in America, but maybe in the entire Western world. Maybe the poet Shelley would compete. There may be some other people who compete. But I would argue that Emerson is the first major person who was spiritual but not religious. He was pursuing a spiritual journey divorced from the institutional church. He had been raised in an institutional church. He cared about, he couldn't help but carry some of that with him, but he was on his own journey. He was one of the first Americans to read Hindu texts, to read Buddhist texts, to become a free thinker and a spiritual but not religious person. And I don't have time to prove this, but trust me, much of American culture, especially high culture, the poets, like if you take someone like Toni Morrison, the great African-American novelist, she looks to Emerson, not just to Emerson, she looks to an African-American figure, but looks to Emerson as one of the great progenitors of what she's doing. Almost, there's so many people I could mention who look to Emerson. And what I think has happened is this Emersonian thing, which used to be kind of an elitist thing, you had to have some free time, you had to have an education to be Emersonian and write poetry or do music or whatever. Now and it was a profoundly democratic thing. We had to develop ourselves, cultivate ourselves for the sake of the whole, for the sake of everyone. And now this Emersonianism, I think, permeates American culture. I think when you look at young people who say, I need to find my passion, that's so Emersonian. When they say, I need to change the world. Emerson's very interested in changing the world. There were all these, like today we have urban farms. Emerson was connected to all the people in the 19th century who were doing these social experiments and creating farms and creating all this kind of stuff. Emerson was like right in the middle of that. Emerson himself didn't want to be living in these communities. He was kind of a loner. But my point is, in mainline religion today, we have an Augustinian theology that we've inherited, but we inhabit an Emersonian culture. And we've done very little, almost nothing, to help our church leaders, our ministers, our people sitting in the pews make this connection between how do you connect these Augustinian beliefs we've inherited to the much more radically open-ended Emersonian culture that we inhabit. And where I am, just to be honest with you, is even though I love Augustine, there are parts of Augustine that I just still love. I'm becoming more and more Emersonian myself in the way I view religion, culture, life. And what that makes for is a version of Christianity that still looks to Jesus. It still looks to prophetic religion. It still looks to justice and righteousness. But it's much more fluid in the partnerships it makes with others, in what it takes to be central and what it takes to be peripheral. And my sense is that until we get more clear about what's the core and what's the periphery, in mainline religion we're still going to struggle. In fact, the thing that I say, and this gets me actually kicked off of committees, it's probably not very smart on my part. I'll get on a committee and I'll say things like, it looks to me like in the Presbyterian Church, our everything decently and in order side is choking our reformed and always reforming side, right? I'm not against decency, I'm not against order, but you can go too far in one direction. We need a little bit more of that reformed and always reforming side, I think, if mainline religion is going to come back into its own, which I'm bullish and think that it will. And I went longer than I said, which is typical of me, but I'm going to stop.